Good morning. My name is Rachel Gustafson, and I am the Director of Engagement at Westminster Presbyterian Church. And for most of you, you'll be joining us on a Sunday morning. We're glad you're here. For the rest of us, we're on our lunch on a Friday, and I'm also so glad that you all are here. For those of you who are wondering who that is, we'll make introductions in a bit. But this is our third adult ed session on dismantling privilege through specific vocational lenses. And this week we'll be focusing on business and technology. So we've invited a handful of Westminster community members with this vocational lens into conversation with an outside expert who is doing this work. Today, that discussion leader is Zaneta Kelsey. For the last 20 years, Zaneta has worked at the intersection of business, technology, and customer experience. She has led global teams with some of the world's largest companies and is the founder of Delightsum, LLC. Zaneta, we're really glad you're here with us. Thank you so much for leading us in this conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here. And thank you for that lovely introduction. Before I go any deeper into my background and history, I would love to introduce my esteemed panel colleagues today. Brent, over to you.
My name is Brent Hall. My wife and Sarah and I have been members of Westminster for a little over 25 years. In my private life, I am the CEO of a third-generation family business in the construction industry. We market products to architects and general contractors. At Westminster, I am active on the Adult Ed Council and also the Personnel Committee. So with that, I will turn it over to Blake.
Thank you. I am Blake Larson. I'm the founder of a currently one-person medical device company here in St. Paul. And I've been at Westminster for about 20 years, and I'm currently serving as a trustee.
Hi, my name is Jackie DeBuse, and I work in corporate communications. And my husband, Jim, and I have been members at Westminster for about 11 years.
Good morning, I'm Jim Tucker. My wife and I, Susan, have been members of Westminster for close to 29 years. And I am a senior construction project manager and with a large retail firm here in the Twin Cities.
And greetings, my name is Mark Schulze. Ann and I have been members at Westminster for 6 years at this stage. I'm a second term elder, just starting as of last week, my second term. And I currently work at Rebel Greens. In fact, you can see the logo on my shirt, which is the local Owatonna based lettuce producer. And I serve as the CEO at Rebel Greens.
Excellent. Thank you so much, panelists and Mark, for that. Before we go a little bit deeper into my background, just want to share a little bit about our agenda with you all who are listening this morning. I'll share a little bit about my faith and personal background and why I'm relevant to speak on this topic of dismantling privilege, especially in corporate settings. And also, then we'll move on to a little bit of biblical foundation with this. And then we'll have a Q&A with our panelists here. So just appreciated Rachel sharing a little bit about my background, but right now I am working as the founder of Delightsum, which is a marketing consulting agency. And I've had quite a journey to have my own business in the business and tech sector. I was born in Washington, D.C. in the 70s. And raised by Christian parents who are both from the South and migrated north. My parents desperately tried for children for 5 years and ended up with my brother right before me, and then myself and my younger brother. So I'm the only girl of 3 kids, and just really grew up with a good sense of family. Born in DC, but we moved over to Prince George's County, Maryland, into a very middle-class suburban setting. And that was my first experience with what is called white flight. as we, as African Americans, moved from the DC area, from DC, the city, the proper, we then moved into the suburbs, and there were a lot of migratory things happening within my own neighborhood. And as I began to experience that, my parents helped to explain that people who have money and privilege make choices, and having money and privilege gives you more opportunity. And that was something that my dad was very focused on enabling for my brothers and myself, was opportunity. And the way that he saw that was by working hard himself. He was one of the first African American database engineers at the National Institute of Health. And he was a database coder at first. And so at the age of 4, I programmed in my first language. And that was introduced to tech at a very early age. I was one of the first kids in my neighborhood who had an Apple IIgs computer, and I loved to print dot matrix banners on that and do fun things. And also started into a little bit of entrepreneurship at that time, because then I would sell those banners when people had parties. So a little bit of business, tech, and also entrepreneurship with that. My parents raised us in a Christian home. They attended an African Methodist Episcopal Zion church. And for those of you who don't know what AME Zion is, it comes out of a history of the Methodist faith. And so I was raised in a church with a lot of liturgy and tradition. And my father was very active in our church, as was my mother, which by default, he being my greatest example. Unfortunately, he passed away 4 years ago, but he was an incredible example to me and was my hero. I've followed in his footsteps, being very active in the church. And I came to faith in the Lord when I was 13 in middle school, and continued on beyond that, and married a pastor. And so my husband and I have been married for 18 years. We live in Denver, Colorado, and we actually met at the cross section of business and technology. My experience with growing up in a Christian home in a setting in Prince George's County, Maryland, that had experienced such extensive white flight was one that is kind of unique, because Prince George's County, Maryland is now about 85% African American, and one of the richest counties of African Americans in the country. And so my experience was one where I recognized very early on that there was privilege and opportunity for those who went after more of a capitalistic approach to life. And the county in PG County, you would see African Americans moving from having, Toyotas and Hondas to beginning to have Mercedes and BMWs. And that began to define success for me very early on. I also recognized, even in my high school, that over the years, when I first started my high school, there was about 70% white population, and we were bused in and began to integrate more of our high school. And by the time I graduated, it was 85% African American, 15% white. And so there were a lot of dynamics at play as I was coming into my formative years and beginning to recognize things. I experienced direct racism quite often growing up. And one of those ways was in my high school, we had a junior trip that we would take, all the juniors in my high school took up to Philadelphia. And one of the things was, it was supposed to be about history. And we did this trip, and we went to visit the Liberty Bell and to look where the Declaration of Independence and all these things were housed, and where our founding fathers of our country had meetings. And there was an African American History Museum across the street that I recognized. And I said, "Oh, can we go? We have a lunch break. We have about an hour. Can we go there?" And I asked this to my geometry teacher, who was one of the chaperones. And he said, "Absolutely not. That's not everybody's history." And that was so hard to take and so hard to swallow. And as a result, I noticed very early on that I am one that is very driven and active, involved, and I like to see change come about. And I did not agree with his position that African American history is only for African Americans. And so what we did, we took it to the principal, we shared our feedback with him, and he encouraged us to form a committee that would bring African American history to all of our high school. So instead of just having this one trip, this one visit where our junior class talked about it, we then had the opportunity to begin talking about racial issues within our high school. And that was very formative for me and very impactful. And I've taken that approach throughout the rest of life and developed that more to say, I recognize these inequities because I'm experiencing them. And I want to see a change come about with that. When I got to college, I decided to go to University of Maryland and major in engineering. My father had a deficiency in his arm, but he was not able to get a prosthetic. And I thought I wanted to be a biomedical engineer because I do want to help people who have deficiencies in their limbs, and I want to build prosthetics. So I enrolled in engineering. I started off with biology in my first year of college and realized that I could not do biology for the rest of my life. So I then transitioned to electrical engineering. And when I went into the electrical engineering classes, I was the only woman and I was the only person of color. And that was really, really hard to deal with because unfortunately, my white and Indian fellow students were not very inclusive or accepting. And I don't think it was intentional. They just had cliques and groups that they had already formed, and no one was willing to easily let me into those spaces. And so at that point, when I was 19, I made a choice, an active choice. I thought about the rest of my life. And I said, if I'm going to be in spaces where I am excluded for whatever reason, maybe because I'm new, maybe because I'm a woman, maybe because I am a Black woman, I want to make choices now that will help enable me to succeed as I work through those things. And do I want to subject myself to this now, knowing that this is potentially how it will be in engineering, electrical engineering for the rest of time? And what is my personality type? And so I made a decision to move away from engineering and go into computer engineering, move away from electrical engineering and go into computer engineering, where I experienced essentially the same exact thing. And so I talked to my advisor, and thank goodness for an advisor who truly understood my experience and the experience of African Americans at the University of Maryland. And he suggested that I look into business because I was very business minded and I had a background that would, and a personality that would allow me to succeed with that. And so I moved into business and computer information systems, and my GPA skyrocketed. It was just the right fit. But I say that because it's important to have someone who recognizes your background, who sees you, who recognizes how you're gifted, how you're wired, and who's thinking about your future and how to help support you in getting there. He was phenomenal at doing that. And I was able to graduate with a 3.8 GPA, and IBM hired me right before graduation, and I moved from one Washington, D.C. to the other Washington to Seattle to work for IBM Global Services. And that's where I met my husband. We got married a couple of years later, and but we were involved in tech right before the dot-com boom back in the early 90s. In the late 90s, early 2000s, and got married and moved to Dallas, Texas. So I'm from DC, moved to Seattle, and then got married, moved to Dallas, which was a whole different experience for me. And I also pursued, I know this is kind of a little bit of a tangent, but I also pursued my master's degree in Christian counseling at that point, because 9/11 happened right as I was making some of those transitions. And my faith told me that it was time to reinvent how I focused. And so I had spent the first 3 years at IBM traveling across the country, working for Fortune 100 projects, implementing e-business strategies. And I had a chance to see a lot of amazing things. And while I was witnessing these things at the Wall Street Journal and various different companies, I began to notice that I was the only person of color. I was the only woman who was in these spaces. And it was very odd to me that was the case. And that was my first experience with corporate America. And so when 9/11 happened, it was an opportunity for me to make a choice of how I would begin to deal with these very big, important, and pressing problems that were happening and were going to continue to happen in my career. And I wanted a stronger foundation and a way to deal with those things. And my faith has always led me to seek God first and understand who He says I am and how He wants me to engage so that I can move forward. So with that, a master's degree in Christian counseling, got married, moved to Dallas, and my husband enrolled in Dallas Theological Seminary, received his master's degree in theology, and then we moved to Colorado to start a church. And when we moved to Colorado, I left corporate. I had been working for a company in Dallas where I also experienced some pretty strong inequities. But as I was in Dallas, I made a decision that we were going to have kids and I wanted to start my own business. And so I started doing some consulting work and we moved to Denver and was able to continue that. While we were in Denver and I was working on my own consulting work, there was a startup company that I engaged with, a tech startup. And I thought, this is the best time to do this. I've never had an opportunity to actually engage a tech startup, and Denver's a great place to do it. And so I went to work for this tech startup company, and it was all the things you think about with tech startup companies, all the movies you've watched. There's beer pong, there's beer at the kegs and the ping pong tables and all those great, and couches everywhere, all those great and fun things. And I loved that. It was a smaller company. We had about less than 50 people who worked in the office. And yet again, I entered the space where I was the only Black woman in the room. And it was so much more acute to me here in Colorado, the experiences that I've had in comparison to the experiences that my colleagues had. And yet again, I found myself in spaces where I just wasn't being included because I was different. So small things like Dungeons and Dragons. I've never played Dungeons and Dragons, but all my colleagues had, because that was a part of their experience. And there's no judgment. That's great. I think it's awesome. But because I hadn't, I began to not be included in after work activities. A lot of folks at the company had dogs. My husband is allergic to dogs, so we don't have one. So when people would bring their dogs and go on walks during the middle of the day, with their dogs, I was not included in that. And so there began to be, I noticed there's this pace at which people operate who have already built in inclusion that don't consider people who are not a part of that normal pace. And a lot of times it's not intentional, but what it leaves the person who's not included, who's just as fun, just as talented, just as engaging, it leaves that person feeling left out. And if we want to build inclusive spaces, we have to go about these things differently. And so I began to reach my limit at the startup because it was so acute. And quite honestly, the Michael Brown killing happened when I was at that startup. And when I walked in and I was just heavy that day, everyone at the startup just continued on about their work. There was nothing that had changed that day for them. Where I came in feeling very heavy. I have two brothers. I had a father, I have a husband, all Black men, and I'm raising two African-American boys. And all I could think about was them. And when I brought it up, I said, well, I understand this is not a part of their experience. So let me at least let them know, hey, today's a little heavy for me, and here's why. There was no change in their behavior. And there was no checking in on me after work or the next day, because it just was not important or relevant in their series of events through their life. And so I began then on a search to understand what it's like to live in a majority culture and majority situation when you're a minority, like really digging into that. And the church that my husband and I started along with Brandon Washington here in Denver is an inclusive church where we're actually about 75% white and 25% other African-American and primarily Latinx and Asian. And so I went to some of my brothers and sisters who are white and I said, hey, these are some of the things I'm experiencing. And the great thing about believers and people of faith is they came alongside me. And that's where I found more understanding was within the body of Christ. And that's why I think spaces like what we're doing today are so very important. That helped me to move on from that startup company to a large electronics manufacturing company who's headquartered here in Colorado. And they brought me on to start their Internet of Things go-to-market. And I was considered an executive. I worked there for about 4.5 years, led global teams, engaged with tons of companies worldwide, and helped to build this multi-million-dollar business for this organization. I was deemed a hypo candidate, high potential candidate, or employee, and given a lot of privilege myself. And I began to kind of experience what it's like to have privilege in a way that I never had before. And I began to see myself move a little bit away from those who were considered other, because I was being more accepted by those other executives. And so when that came to light, I thought, this is such a troubling thing. This is so very difficult for people to kind of navigate, because you have some majority pulls in one direction where you're talking about, ways that you're impacting big things, you're spending money, you're making moves, you're making strategies, you're executing those things, you're looking at dashboards, you're looking at reports, and people become less individual who are over here and more a part of just a number. And so I began to recognize just how much our Christian faith has to ground us. And so that leads me to thinking about these inequities from a biblical perspective, and how should we approach those things. And the very first thing that I have found that is fundamental is thinking about Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, that we are image bearers. We are bearing the image of Christ. And it says, so God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. All of us, every single one of us, bear his image together. That is what connects us to him and one another. That's what differentiates us and kangaroos from who he sees us to be. We are his image bearer. We are stamped with the image of God, each and every one of us, no matter our handicap, no matter what our sexuality is, no matter who we are image bearers. And that's who the Lord has granted us to be. And then I think about, so if we are made in his image, and we have this esteem as image bearers, then what is it that he calls us to do with that? And there was a lawyer in the book of Luke who asked Jesus that question. His question to Jesus was asking him about what do I need to do to live this life, for you? What do I need to do to inherit the kingdom of God? And Jesus said, you know the answer to this. And the answer is, he said, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And there's that ampersand right there, that and, A-N-D, and love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yours. It sounds like just a beautiful thing, right? Like there are slogans out there, coffee mugs that have love your neighbor as yourself. But then Jesus went on to explain what that actually means. Loving your neighbor as yourself. And he gave the example of the Good Samaritan, about a man traveling on a road who was beaten by thieves and left to die. And people came and saw him on the side of the road and just walked by, paid him no attention at all. This man who was dying on the side of a road. And then the Good Samaritan came along and saw him. First, he saw him, and then he went to help him. At the very end of this, he's allowing the man on his donkey as he walks for miles and miles into town so that he could save the man's life. The Samaritan was not an acceptable person in society, but he took it upon himself to, even although he was mistreated, to take this man who was dying on the side of a road and lift him up and get him help. There's also the example of how Jesus treated Zacchaeus in Luke chapter 19. And Zacchaeus was thought as the worst of worst. He was a tax collector for the Roman government. Jews did not like him. They did not love him. He was exploiting them. He was taking advantage of them. He was also really, really short. There weren't great things about Zacchaeus. And Jesus saw him and he called out to him in a crowd and said, I'm going to stay at your house. He went to where he saw the man. He went to where he was. He engaged him in his space and he stayed at his house. These are the things that the Bible has set before us to do when people are other. And then I think about this. Why is this so radical? Why is this so not the norm that's happening within not just corporate America, but all types of spaces? Why aren't we doing more of that as believers, as brothers and sisters in Christ? And I think about Jesus's example. In general, Jesus was very consistent. He did not falter. He did not fail. He was super radical about righteousness, though. And I think about what he did in the temple with the money changers. He went into the temple. There were people that were taking advantage of other people and dishonoring God's temple and exchanging money. And Jesus went in and he got a cord and he went to whip them. And he flipped over the money tables because it was unrighteousness that was happening. He was bold. He made a very big public statement about it because it was unrighteous. And those are the things that we need to do when we see unrighteousness. And unrighteousness is anything that doesn't honor the image of God. And so we need to make sure that we're doing things that are better about that. And so we can look at these things from an individual perspective about how are we seeing other people, how are we thinking about these things, and how are we how are we living our lives as image bearers for the kingdom. We can also think about them systemically within the spaces that we're in. if you at your organization only have African Americans coming in at entry-level positions, that's a tactic, and great. That's better than the way things had been. But what about African Americans at the executive level? What about those who are other at the executive level? I have some stats here. In the S&P, of 50 of the biggest companies in the S&P, out of 279 top executives, 5 are African American. Just 5 out of 270. That's less than 2%. And there are organizations like Apple, where 3% of their leadership overall are African American in VP spaces and above. Why is that? That just doesn't make sense when the 20% or plus of their lower level employees are African American. So I want to challenge us to think about, why do these injustices exist? And what do we do from an individual perspective? And what do we do from a systemic perspective? And I think some of those things come into, how are we thinking about coaching and mentoring those who are other than us? Are we taking the time to see those folks? Are we taking the time to reach out to them, that in a way that, maybe HR hasn't asked you to do that? Maybe if you are the CEO, maybe you do that on your own. Create a group and coach and mentor and provide your guidance and your advice on how you did what you did. What about ways to be more inclusive? One of my experiences, and this is funny, I laugh at this now, but it didn't feel good at the time. We were at an executive dinner up in Vail, and the president of my group had all of us, his executive leaders from marketing, sales, operations, and so on, and HR, and we're sitting having dinner in this beautiful place. And we're going around saying, hey, where are you going for the summer? This is a few years ago. And the first guy started off and he said, yeah, I'm taking the family to Lake Powell. And I was like, oh, where's that? And it was almost like, I asked the most terrible question. You don't know where Lake Powell is? No, I don't. I'm sorry. And they were like, you've never been to the lake for the summer? Yikes, I haven't. I'm sorry. But does that make me bad? Does that make me wrong? And I think we have to think about those questions like that. And it's great. I love that they go to the lake. And, I was like, hey, I'll come. Me and my family will join in. It'll be great. But because I haven't, though, does that make me wrong? And so I want to make sure that we challenge one another to make spaces more inclusive. If someone doesn't have your experience, that doesn't mean they're wrong. It certainly doesn't mean you're wrong, but how can you bring them in? Why don't you ask them about, well, what are you doing for the summer? And maybe they have some financial challenges, or maybe they have a parent who's sick. And so that you can engage them where they are, the same way Jesus did. And so those are just some things I want us thinking about. But now I really want to turn it over to this wonderful panel that we have here. And I want to ask a couple of questions. So my first question for my great colleagues here: in what ways have you personally assessed yourself as an image bearer of God to ensure that you're bearing His image in your corporate and office settings? For example, when you're in the office, in what ways do you self-assess yourself as an image bearer around these spaces? So that's my first question. I'm not afraid to pick on someone. So Mark, I'm going to pick on you if you don't mind. In what ways have you self-assessed yourself as an image bearer of God? When God says we're created in His image, how do you self-assess to make sure that you're honoring the image that He's given you?
Okay, well, thank you very much. And that was a terrific introduction, and you've got a fantastic resume of experience. So congratulations. Your wealth of information and knowledge and experience is second to none. So I think for me, it's generally it's an awareness issue. I personally try to behave every day a little bit like you mentioned earlier, which is do as Jesus would do, and basically behave as Jesus would behave. So I constantly try to check myself. Am I behaving? Am I asking the questions in a respectful way? Am I treating people as I would like to be treated? And am I doing to others as I would like to be done unto myself? So those are sort of the very simple things that I do more or less on a daily basis with my staff or with team or with production crews.
That is beautiful. Thank you for your kind words. I appreciate that. I think those are great questions that you're asking yourself. Blake, can I turn it over to you and ask, in what ways do you self-assess as an image bearer? Maybe when you've just gotten off that Zoom call and you may have heard something that you rattled you a little bit, or you may have seen something. In what ways do you self-assess?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Like I said, I'm a kind of a one-person shop that's still kind of in startup mode. So most of my ideas are theoretical as to what I should do. I'm doing more listening than probably talking for a lot of this on that. But yeah, it's the idea of you should really probably try to plan ahead for what you want to do instead of trying to fix things later. So that's why I'm really trying to pay attention to this stuff, because you just, as you mentioned, if you're gonna have people in senior leadership represent God's creation, you better think about that first and not necessarily representing all the people you know that just happen to look like you.
That's excellent. Yeah. Thank you for that. And I think, that reminds me of when I started my career, I was given the book by about 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's a Stephen Covey book, and I know it's from 20 plus years ago. But the key thing that he talked about was beginning with the end in mind. And like, I love what you're doing, because you're planning, you're beginning, thinking about those next steps. So thank you for sharing that. Second question here for this group: in what ways have you loved your neighbor, in this case, underrepresented groups, African Americans, in your corporate or office environments? In what ways have you loved your neighbor as yourself? And I'm going to start, Jackie, with you.
Sure. Thank you, Zaneta. And I'd start from a place of something that was really interesting and sort of change the conversation around privilege and loving your neighbor and bringing others with you. Was, I think it's really easy to say, I'm not in a position of privilege. I have nothing to share. And I think that for me, it was changing. Everybody has privilege in some way. Everybody has a background. Everybody knows somebody. Everybody brings a different story. How can you break off something that you have to share it with someone else and bring them along? You don't have to be in a position of power. You don't have to come from a place of privilege. And so as I think about loving your neighbor, bringing others with you, it's really, how do you find the ways to help? So just as you might offer a neighbor a cup of sugar, how can you take something you have and share it to bring other people in? Zaneta, you talked about, widening the circle and being in places where that circle wasn't open. And there are a lot of places at work where, we can think about doing that differently, whether it's adding somebody to a meeting or acknowledging what somebody added in a meeting, which gives a piece of your privilege to someone else, so that everyone is there on perhaps more of an equal playing field. And I think that really does go for, how do we care for each other, but also how do we bring others along with our privilege, because we know that we're also going to be looking for places for others to bring us along and to work together on that.
Gosh, I love that. That is some really great practical advice and some examples of how to do it, just from a very individualistic perspective, that you would invite somebody into a meeting who might not have that exposure into a particular topic. So they might get to learn a little bit more, or witness how other people are engaging with one another, and be prepared for that. Because to be quite honest, I think if we all answer this question, there's no easy way to prepare to be in a corporate setting, right? You just get pushed in and you have to kind of deal with various different things. even when you go to college, there's no, here's what you do when you enter this particular, situation in a corporate setting. And so I think it's really being encouraged by example. And I love that, Jackie, that you're doing that. That's fantastic. Brent, can I ask you the same question? In what ways have you loved your neighbor as yourself in your corporate setting?
Yeah. I think that's a fascinating question. It's something I've been thinking about more and more over the past several months as events have unfolded in our public life in the news. I think one of the things I have become to realize is that I have not been as engaging and welcoming as I should to my neighbors. I think one of the things as you sort of look back, and as I've been doing some reading and some self-reflection, realizing that, if you are hiring for positions and, hire for 3 or 4 positions over a year or two, and you realize at the end that everybody you interviewed, because everybody who responded to that platform, position advertisement, everyone looks like me, and anybody we hired looks like me. And so it's been reading books recently that is just for so people know, Devil in the Grove, which is an amazing story of Thurgood Marshall as attorney for the NAACP, and most recently The Cross and the Lynching Tree, and trying to maybe get de-silo my life a little bit, to say that I have some opportunity, I have some privilege. In small business, you need a job, you hire somebody, you move on to the next thing. Maybe as CEO of the company, I have a little bit more time to spend, and maybe I can reach out a little bit more and go that extra mile. We don't have, when we hire for a position, maybe it's just one person in that position in the whole company. We don't have 15, 20, 800 engineers as you might for a larger company. That doesn't mean I can't look a little farther, or I can't invite somebody maybe to stretch for a position. I at least have that conversation with them as we're going forward. Not everybody you interview are you going to hire, but maybe the interview that you offer somebody, and it might be a reach goal for them, might give them the sense that they're closer to that goal than they thought before, and it can help them get their next job.
Thanks so much for that, Brent. I love that you're talking about recruiting and hiring strategies, and also thinking of it from a CEO perspective, because truly in your organization, the power sits with you and stems from you. And I love that you are taking the time to really wrestle with these topics. And I think from a recruiting perspective, as you talked about, if we fish in the ponds that we know, we're going to get fish that look kind of like us, which is fine. But I think diversifying that into different pools makes it even stronger. And they talk about diversity as a strength. And I love that you're wrestling with that and contending with that. Thank you so much for that response. Question number 3, in what ways have you entered new spaces? Spaces that are maybe not popular or not conventional, similar to the way that Jesus entered into the space with Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was unpopular, he was considered other, but Jesus went, he saw him, and he said, I'm going to come to dinner at your house. In what ways in your corporate environment are you entering spaces or planning to enter spaces that you haven't before, where other and underrepresented resources and people are? And Jim, that is a question I'll start with you.
Yes, thank you, Zaneta. A lot of thought-provoking material here today. I guess I'll dial back to George Floyd and talk a little bit about where we have come as a nation, and at the company that I work for. I think there has just been such a heightened awareness of this as an issue that we need to talk about it, and we need to have difficult discussions. The fact that we have a panel like this today talking about this is something new, and Something that I can't ever recall having these kinds of discussions in the past. But in the last year, we have had, and where I work, there have been multiple opportunities for us to have discussions, either one-on-one with our coworkers about it. We have had opportunities to have small group discussions within our departments, or even company-wide. When something dramatic has happened in the news, our company has kind of opened opportunities for us to come and just talk, and no judgment, no real discussion even really about the way people feel, just allowing people to talk about how they're feeling at the moment when something has happened. And so I appreciate those opportunities, and it has allowed me to participate in some of those in some of those forums, and say things out loud that I might not have said just sitting in the lunchroom with my coworkers. We've been given the authority, or given the non-judgmental, there's no judgment in any of these. So we have the right to speak up in these situations, and I think that's what needs to happen. We need to get this out on the table so that we can all discuss it.
That's great. And I think, Jim, you're absolutely right about the opening dialogue, creating spaces for people to exchange their feelings, their thoughts, their experiences and expressions is critical, especially at a time like this, and especially around the things that you all have been experiencing up where you are. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to ask the same question, Jacqueline, to you on this one. In what ways have you entered spaces the same way Jesus did with Zacchaeus? In what ways have you entered spaces that may be unconventional or unpopular? How have you shown up in those ways?
It's a good question that I think there's a difference between uncomfortable and unpopular. And so what comes to mind is something that was maybe unconventional versus unpopular, which is, as we think about hiring, thinking about bringing in candidates in a really different way. And so before it was, we can think really concretely about bringing in diverse candidates as we're looking to fill a role. But we took it a step further to say, how do we build a pipeline that actually invests in connections with people so that when we have a role, we've got some talent that we can pull from, instead of needing to pull somebody into an interview. We actually have invested time in relationships. In a way that was uncomfortable because it felt as though it was working to be inclusive, but also could cross over the line into making people of diverse groups feel other, to feel as though we were developing specific programs or initiatives because they were different. And that also didn't feel right. And it didn't feel inclusive. But once we were able to sort of move past that discomfort, and we saw what could really come from this and what could be the change that comes from this, the group was on board and we were able to move that through. But it sort of took that moment of reflection to say, we want to do the right thing. What is the right thing? And that might be doing something really unconventional. And you know what, it might not work, but we're going to try it. And in the end, we have to, you said, Stephen Covey talking about keeping the end in mind. And that was truly a driving factor in something that we probably wouldn't have done a few years ago.
Yes, experimentation, being willing to try something new, I think is incredibly important. And especially when it is unconventional. Fail fast, they say, Blake, in the startup world. So, Blake, I'm going to turn this last question over to you, then Brent, then Mark to answer. And this will be our final question. In what ways can you be more radical? Similar to Jesus when he saw the unrighteousness in the temple. He pulled out the cords, he called out the unrighteousness, he made a public display about it, and he told them they were doing wrong in his Father's house. They were not representing what God wanted. In what ways can you be more radical about calling out
That would be interesting. It's occasionally it might be more my thing for colleagues like myself in those networking situations, not only working with them, but maybe calling them out. Because when I go to networking events, boy, it's white men specifically. Let me tell you that are in the startup community, particularly medical device. It's striking. So being able to say, "Hey, we need to do better," talking to other things like that, to really be more public about trying to get trying to just really fix some of these problems that we've been talking about today, to really to fix the industry, the whole pipeline from investing, investors to employees to customers, top to bottom. It's a lot thing, and we'll have to just keep working at it. But if it's just sort of brushed in the background and it's, well, we'll do that later down the line, or we'll assign somebody to do that for 5% time. Need to do better. Challenge others, I guess, would be my way of
Thank
putting
you for sharing that. And I think it requires that, to call it out and to acknowledge it and call it out. We have a couple of minutes left. Brent, we'll turn it over to you. How can you be more radical?
I think one of the ways, to echo what Blake said, I have friends in my industry who, after the George Floyd killing, called me to see checking how they were doing. And there was some hedging on the edges, like, well, I didn't see the whole tape, and I didn't do that. And I tried to be very intentional and say, no, you and I walk out of that interaction 100 out of 100 times. And there's no space for opinion in that, really, as far as I look at it. So when you see it, when in interpersonal conversation, you can act out against that and frankly speak the truth as you see it. The other thing I would say is to recognize that all of us have a certain amount of influence and agency and privilege in our communities. I am a business owner in one community and roughly a 50-year resident of another. As Rachel knows, I've been working to set up a meeting to sit down with my chief of police and make sure when people are pulled over, they're treated well. Because I don't want anybody in my community treated different than my son and I would be if we got pulled over.
I would say that that's pretty radical, and kudos to you. And we can be praying for that conversation that you'll have. And thank you for doing that. Mark, over to you. How can you be more radical?
Well, our management team went through a strategy process last November. And part of that strategy process is that we set new core values. And the core value that rose to the top was respect for all people, respect for all people, and respect for all people. And we spent a lot of time talking about that, what that meant in everyday words and everyday actions, and what was intolerable in that respect. And we took that message company-wide and we delivered it to every employee, and we stand by that. And if people are not respecting all people, they're getting called out for it, and to the point of being dismissed. So I think that was one way that we felt like we could play our part in leveling the field a little bit.
I think that was a big part to play, and thank you for working for that. Because what essentially you're saying is we're all made in his image, and we want to make sure that that righteousness and dignity is brought to every single person. So thank you for that. I just want to leave us with a couple of takeaways. My encouragement to you all is to be vigilant. These things are happening and they're real. And I can tell you, as somebody who's experienced it and somebody who has family that experiences it, and do the self-assessment. It's important for all of us, myself included. Like I said, when I was in the corporate environment and I began getting into these executive spaces, I began moving away from what was foundational and other. And we need to self-assess continually and regularly. Be prayerful. We have the King of Kings on our side. And for those of us who have given our faith, have confessed our faith to the Lord, he is behind us. He is for us and not against us. And he gives us every single thing we need to live righteous lives. Educate yourselves. There's so many books out that have come out. Brent mentioned a few of them. There's Urban Apologetics with Eric Mason and Brandon Washington. There's How to Be an Anti-Racist with Ibrahim Kennedy. So many books. Enter into those spaces where other people are. I love what Blake said about, he's in networking environments and areas where people are connected, that he's not, where people are connected, where there is not a lot of diversity in those spaces. Enter spaces where there are diverse people. Be radical, like we just talked about. And more so than anything else, if you have power and privilege, use it for the furthering of God's kingdom. I want to thank you so much to my panel guests for joining me. And Rachel, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Zaneta, for sharing your story with us and offering wisdom from Scripture and asking us to apply it. I especially want to thank all of you as well who joined us for this conversation. Zaneta might not know this about Minnesotans, but we don't call each other out very often. And so it can be a unique experience to feel like someone asks you by name to share your experience or your story or your voice for us who tend to be a little more demure. And so I'm really grateful for all of us here answering that call, showing up today and lending your voice and your experience and your perspectives, because we know we're all learners. We're still in process. And so it can be a vulnerable space to share where you are. And I'm grateful for all of you being willing to do that. I also would like to invite all of you back next Sunday to continue in another segment of this conversation. Asbury Jones will be joining us to lead a conversation. He's entitled The Gospel of Public Health and Health Equity. So particularly for those of you in the healthcare field or public health, this will be a great conversation. And we hope that all these conversations will continue beyond just this day and into other spaces within the Westminster community. So thank you all for being here today. And please do let me or Brent know in Adult Ed if this kind of programming has been good or helpful or how it could be more helpful. We'll see you next week.